Oh, this tripod is a little wiggly. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Today's video is one that has been requested a lot. It's one that quite honestly I have been putting off, but we're doing it today. And yes, I'm a little bit nervous, but I'm also excited. Today's video is going to be me sharing my testimony. So for those of you who might not know what that means, your testimony is essentially your story. And especially as we're talking about that in the context of faith, it is the story of how you came to Jesus and of how he drew you to himself and how he saved you. And so that's what I'm going to be sharing today. And everybody's testimony is so different. Sometimes you hear these testimonies of crazy things happening in people's lives or them going through something just really intense and how that is what God used to bring that person to him. And so sometimes it's this really definitive moment in time that that person can look back to and point to and say, that's exactly when God turned my life around. And it's this momentous, crazy event. I think of the story of Paul in the Bible on the road to Damascus, where Jesus appeared in this bright light and he was blind for 3 days. And Paul went from being somebody who was persecuting Christians to somebody who wrote most of the New Testament and was going on all these missionary journeys telling people about Jesus. And so for some people, it's this dramatic event and this definitive moment in time where there was a big shift and a big turn. And then for others of us, it's this more gradual thing where over time we are learning more about Jesus and different events happen in our lives that ultimately bring us to this point where we make a decision to give our lives to him, to surrender our lives to him. And I remember growing up, sometimes I would hear people talking about testimonies and sharing your testimony, and I felt like I needed to have some crazy thing that happened to me or go through something really difficult or really hard in order to have a true testimony. And that is simply not true. Even if you just think about how relationships start, sometimes it's this really instantaneous thing where a guy and a girl meet and they just know, and it's just this whirlwind thing. And other times it happens more gradually and it's not some crazy event that brings them together, but maybe they were friends for a long time or they knew of who each other were, and then over time they slowly started to build and to develop a relationship. And so in the same way that relationships happen in all sorts of different ways, the stories of how God brings us to him are also different. And every single one is miraculous, because whether it was some crazy dramatic event that God used to bring you to him, or whether it was a bunch of seemingly ordinary things that over time brought you to that point, the reality is that no testimony is ordinary, because every single time somebody gives their life to Jesus, what has happened there is that he has brought us from death to life. Ephesians 2 says that we were dead in our trespasses, but God, being rich in mercy because of the great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead in our trespasses, made us alive together with Christ. And so I want to share this today, one, because several of you have asked to hear my testimony, and then also because I think that sharing stories is a really powerful thing. I think that when we hear others share their story, we can find in their story pieces of our own that maybe resonate with us or speak to us or encourage us. And this is actually exactly what the Bible tells us to do as well. In Revelation, it says that we overcome by the blood of the Lamb and the word of our testimony. And so we overcome ultimately because of the blood of Jesus and because of what he did for us in making a way for us to be restored to relationship with God. And so we overcome because of Jesus's blood, because of what he did for us. And we also overcome by sharing with other people what he did for us, what he has done for us, what he is continuing to do for us. And when we share our stories of how God brought us to him, we can encourage other people, we can show them who he is, and it can be an opportunity for God to work and to move in their life and in their heart. And so I hope that me sharing my story, that it is an encouragement to you, that it builds you up, that God would speak through it. And that is what I am praying as I am filming this video. So without further ado, let's just get into it. And here is my story. So in order to share my testimony, really, I need to share the testimony of my family, and specifically my dad, and how God worked in his life, because that really set in motion how God began to work in mine. So really, as far back as I can remember, I grew up in a Christian home and going to church, but really a lot of that started to happen when I was about 6 years old. And so both my parents grew up going to a Catholic church, and for them it wasn't really something where they had any sort of personal relationship with Jesus. It was really just something that they did because their families did it, and it was more of a tradition sort of thing that they did. And so growing up, my family went to a Catholic church until I was about 6 years old, and really my memories from that were playing in the pews, the little fold down pews that they would have in the Catholic church. My cousin also went to that church, so we would bring our dolls, and then as all of the different stuff was happening in the service, we would be sitting down there in the pews playing with our dolls. And so that's really the big part of what I remember. And during this time, so my dad is a truck driver, and he would be doing these truck driving routes, and somehow came across the 700 Club radio show, which is like a Christian broadcast, and he basically stumbled across it from what he shared with me, and then started tuning in and listening over a period of time and hearing about Jesus, hearing about the gospel. And after a period of time of listening to this broadcast, he actually called in to the operator and gave his life to Jesus. And I always just get emotional thinking about that and think that it is so incredible because God can literally use anything, and he used that in my dad's life. And I think about the childhood that I had, and for me growing up in a Christian home and going to a Christian school, which I'll share all of that in a minute, and really the foundation I had of growing up hearing about who Jesus is, and having, you know, nights where my dad would sit on the couch with my brother and I, and we would read through the Gospel of John, and he would teach us about Jesus. And all of that experience that I had and that foundation that I had for my life happened first because of the work that God did in my dad's life. And it was actually really cool. I wrote a blog post about this a couple years ago, but my dad and I used to do father-daughter retreats at this Christian camp, Hume Lake. I've talked about it before. I actually go up there still with the high school girls that I work with, but we would go up and we would do these father-daughter retreats. And we went up a couple years ago, and he was just sharing more of his story with me and talking about how the year before he met my mom, he was in this horrible motorcycle accident where he went down on the freeway and really should have died, but there was this car that started doing zigzags behind him to protect him from other cars coming and running him over. And that was before he met my mom, before he knew Jesus. And I just think of the work that God was slowly doing in his heart to draw him to him for the sake of his own life, but also so that he could lead our family to Jesus. And so that moment of my dad calling into the radio station and giving his life to Jesus, that happened when I was, I believe, 6 years old. And so at that time, my dad got plugged into a Christian church in the area and started bringing our family. And so again, really as far back as I remember, I would go to this church. I remember going to Sunday school and all of that kind of stuff. And then also around that time, my parents enrolled my brother and I into a Christian school because the church we were going to also had a school attached to it. And so it was in second grade that I started going to a Christian school. And so really all around me in my classes, in church, in Sunday school, and all this stuff, I was hearing about who Jesus is and what he did and the gospel. And I remember there being several times that my Sunday school teacher would share the gospel and invite us to pray along as he prayed to receive Jesus and to give our lives to him. And so I remember doing that, like, honestly several times and just thinking, did it work? Was this really it? Did I really give my life to Jesus? And never really talking to anybody about it. And then when I was probably about 8 or 9, I just remember so vividly sitting down at our dining room table in the kitchen, and my dad had come in and we were having a conversation, and he had asked me if I had ever given my life to Jesus and that if it was something I wanted to do. And I remember telling him that I had, you know, prayed along with the Sunday school teacher, but wasn't really sure. And so, you know, obviously looking back, I can know that yes, as much as I was able to understand it, that I had made that decision. But there on that day, my dad sat down and prayed with me, and I prayed and gave my life to Jesus. And so that is sort of the definitive moment that I remember of giving my life to him. But of course, with a testimony, I think that we are continually growing and learning in what it means to truly give our lives to Jesus, growing and learning in our understanding of the gospel. And so I definitely think that that was the turning point or the decision point, but there have been several other points in my life where God has just brought me into a deeper understanding of what that means and continually grown in that surrender of just giving my life to him. And so I just want to share a couple of those points. And really, God is always working in our lives every single day, but I think that there are those key turning points or those defining moments when God just did a significant work in our lives, and we can look back on those and see that as being a turning point when we really grew in our walk with Him. And so I want to share a couple of those points. And the next one that I think was really a key turning or defining point for me was actually toward the end of high school. So I, again, grew up going to a Christian school, grew up in a Christian high school, having chapels and Bible classes and all that stuff. And I knew that I loved God. I knew that I loved Jesus, but it was almost like this thing being in a Christian school where it's like you knew that you were supposed to believe in God. You knew that you were supposed to love Him, but you didn't want to get too overboard with it, or at least that's what I thought. I remember literally having the thought in high school of thinking, I know I'm supposed to love God. I know that that is a good thing to do, but you know, I want to be like reasonable about it. I don't want to be somebody who's just like so crazy about it or just obsessed with it or any of that kind of stuff. And I actually had one of my best friends who was. She was sort of like the Jesus girl, is how people knew her. And she was the one where, you know, you would be in chapel and we'd be listening to worship music and we'd all sort of be there, you know, standing and maybe kind of like bobbing a little bit, but not getting too crazy with it. And she was just like in abandon, worshiping God. And you could just see from her in the way that she talked about God, in the way that she lived her life, in the way that she interacted with people, that she just had this love for Jesus. And it wasn't just something that she had because she was supposed to, or it was the right thing to do, was to believe in God or to love God, but it was this actual passion that was oozing out of her. And it was actually probably around our junior year that her and I, Marlene, that's her name, she's one of my best friends still, that her and I started to become closer. And the closer I got to her, the more I was able to see just this passion and this love for Jesus, that it wasn't just something she did because it was the good Christian girl thing to do, but there was an actual love for Him inside of her, a conviction that drove her in her life. And so as we started to get closer, I started to see that more in her, and I thought to myself, man, there's something more here. Maybe there's more to this whole faith thing. Maybe it's not just being a good Christian girl and doing all of the right things and saying all the right things, but maybe there's something I'm missing. And as we started to get closer, she would just always be so encouraging to me, just praying for me and telling me, Case, like, God just has plans for your life. He loves you, and just believing in me. And looking back, I just see how that made me start to believe in that too, and start to believe that there could be more. And it created this spark in me to want to pursue a deeper relationship with God. And so really that's what started it, and what started me wanting to do things like read my Bible or just seek God or pray or really build a relationship with Him outside of just going to, you know, youth group or going to my Bible classes or whatever the case may be. And so I think a big thing I want to point out just from that point in the story is how important it is the people that we surround ourselves with, because they have a huge capacity to influence us. And I look back on my friendship with Marlene and how much that really set me on a path of wanting to actually build a relationship with God and to take ownership of that, rather than just doing what I had always done because it's what we do, rather than just sort of going through the motions of faith because it was what my family did and because it was just sort of what we did, really taking ownership of that and pursuing Jesus for Him. And so from there, this newfound spark to want to pursue Jesus, it ultimately is what led me to want to go to Biola, which is where I went for college, because I think before that I thought, you know, I had the Christian education, went to a Christian school, I kind of want to try something different for college. And then it was those final years of high school, my junior and my senior year, as I was starting to take my faith more seriously, that I just realized, like, man, so many people talk about how college is such a formative time and it really can set us on the path for our future. And so I just started thinking about it more and thought, man, if these are going to be such formative years for me, then I would love for those years to be able to take place in an environment that is going to encourage me in my walk with God and really set that firm foundation. And so I definitely don't think it is a necessity at all to go to a Christian university. And I think that oftentimes, sometimes even going to a place that isn't a Christian environment actually causes us to grow in other ways. But I know that for me, being at Biola, being at a Christian college was really truly such a blessing and really set such a foundation for me in my walk with God. And that is where the next turning point was in a lot of different ways. And it was my time there that ultimately ultimately led to me sitting here right now in front of a camera talking to you. So let me explain that a little bit. I think first of all, there is something so powerful about living in Christian community. And so I was going to Bible classes, going to chapels, and then coming back to my dorm and living with friends who also wanted to grow in their faith. And so that was a big part of it. And then my junior year is when I would say there was the next big turning point for me. So there was this guy, I feel like a boy is always part of the story, and we had been friends throughout most of my time at Biola, but we had also liked each other at different points. And I think I always thought that something would eventually happen. And so when it didn't, and when things ultimately didn't work out, I was super disappointed. And around the same time, I had also applied to be an RA and ended up not getting that either. And so looking back, those don't feel like huge things, but at the time I think it was really the first time that I had experienced rejection in a way that felt really significant to me. And I think I always thought that I was a confident person growing up, but I think that what God really used those two situations to show me is that really what it was is that the things I was finding my identity in had never shifted up until that point. And God allowed those things to shift. He allowed those things to be stripped away, always feeling like I was approved of and liked and accepted. And having those things happen, I realized that I had always found my worth in that sense of acceptance from other people, in feeling liked, but that I had never truly found my identity and my security and my purpose in Christ alone. And so really that junior year at Biola was a rough one for me. And I really feel like with those two situations and just other things that God was doing in my life, it was almost like God was stripping away the things that I had always found my identity in and bringing me to this place of bare bones where I just felt like I had no idea who I was. But he was doing that so that he could ultimately build me back up in him. And that is where the next part of my story comes in, which was my senior year at Biola. I studied abroad in London. And if you've watched a lot of videos on my channel, you've probably heard me reference that before, or if you've read my blog, because it was truly such a transformative and impactful time in my life that really set me on the path that even of where I am today and what I am doing today. And so it was really just coming out of this season when I just felt like I had no idea who I was. I felt lost. And then I ended up studying abroad in London my senior year. And it was almost as if God took me away from everybody that I knew and brought me to this place where he could build me up in him. And so there's literally so much I could say about that semester abroad. I think, you know, going into it completely terrified to take that step and to go into something that was totally unknown. But God just worked through it in these crazy ways. I have so many stories I could share about just conversations I had with friends over there and at the church that we were going to over there and in small groups, and just ways that God spoke into my life and began to build me up in him and show me who he had created me to be, and begin to just build me up in him. And so again, looking back, I would say that my junior year, it was almost like this stripping away, and this time in London was God slowly starting to rebuild me into who he had created me to be all along. And it was actually during my time in London that I first started my blog. So if you're not familiar, it was actually my blog that started all of this before my YouTube channel. I started that in 2013, which would have been the time that I was in London. And I still remember the conversation that really started it all. It was with one of my very best friends, who still is to this day, Kelly, if you are watching this. So Kelly also went to Biola, but we didn't know each other at all at Biola. And then we met in London because we were both doing the study abroad program. And during this semester, there was just so much that God was doing, so much that he was showing me, and I was just growing so much in my walk with him, and just seeing him work and bring healing to all these areas in my heart that had felt so hurt before. And as I was learning and growing in my walk with him, I just naturally had this desire to want to share the things that I was learning. And so I remember one day Kelly and I, we walked from our university campus down to a Starbucks, and it was just this rainy little walk through London, which is just so magical. And we were just talking and honestly sharing our stories with each other and the things that we had both been going up to in our lives leading up to our time in London. And we just talked for hours and finally sat down at this Starbucks in London. And I was telling her about this idea I had to want to write a post sharing something that God was showing me in my life. And I was terrified and I thought it was crazy. And I remember Kelly just speaking so much encouragement into what I was sharing with her and encouraging me to step forward and write it. And I had no idea even how to start a blog or really all of the things that it could ultimately and has led to. I just knew I had a desire to want to share the work that God was doing in my life with the hopes of encouraging other people. And so that's what ultimately led to me starting the first version of my blog. I started the one that I currently have 2 years later, and that's when I really started to get consistent with it. And then a couple of years into that is when I started this YouTube channel. So hi guys. But really those are some key points in my story. I know there's so much more I could share, so many more details and just ways that God has worked in my life, but I hope that gives you a little overview of my testimony and allows you to know me a little bit more, and I hope that it encouraged you. I would really love for you to comment below sharing something with me about you or just introducing yourself. I would love to say hi. And then also if you have any other questions for me, leave them down in a comment below. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up, and then also hit the subscribe button if you haven't already. Thank you so much for listening to my story, and I will see you in my next video. Bye.